Okay, thank you. First, thank you for inviting me for the summer school, and not just for the conference. I've done lots of summer schools in my time, and I always enjoy it because I tend to learn more from the students, because I'm forced to put into question all the things I say. What I did today, I was asked to contribute to a summer school on the politics of difference. And the politics of difference for me is a very charged subject, very simply because I lived in apartheid South Africa for 20 years. And in apartheid South Africa, what you had was an unequivocal politics of difference, a politics of difference which became the politics of apartheid. So I've always been very suspicious of difference as a term and difference as a form of politics. And I was very suspicious of so-called postmodern forms of difference. And I want to suggest that in fact we can't consider a politics of difference without some reference to universalism, but I'll come back to that later on. The question that you probably asked yourself when you received the reading list was why on earth I asked you to read an essay from the early 1960s by Derrida on différance as opposed to difference. Especially because popular mythology has it that this is one of the founding texts of postmodernism. And that story goes simply that people like Jean-François Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition, Jacques Derrida in Structure, Sign and Play, in Difference, in The Margins of Philosophy, and a set of other texts, that they established the politics of what came to be called postmodernism in the 1970s and 1980s. And the cliche goes like this. First of all, these writers, Derrida in particular, apparently established the idea that the universal is always some form of oppression. Universalism, in other words, stands in for hidden forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. And of course, that postmodern argument is simply the deepening of a longer argument about ideology in the Marxist tradition. And ideology in the Marxist tradition, the argument essentially is that ideology is a form of consciousness that causes you to misrecognize the conditions of your existence, so that you don't really understand how it is you're living, you don't see the structures of oppression for what they are. And if you lift the veil, part of the revolution is becoming conscious. The proletariat in Marx's account is, or in Lukács's reading of Marx, the proletariat is the subject and the object of history, but only when it overcomes its particularism, when it lifts the veil. But of course Marx does this in the name of a universal, in the name of universal emancipation. The proletariat is the subject and the object of history because it emancipates everybody for Marx. What the postmodern argument supposedly does is to get rid of the idea that there is such a universal position. In fact, the mask is the idea that there is a universal. Ideology is the idea that you can know what the truth is, that you can know what the universal is. So the postmodern argument goes. So universalism, first of all, in the cliche version, the version I'm going to challenge, universalism is viewed as a form of oppression. Secondly, there is an emphasis as a consequence in the postmodern argument on particularism. This goes very simply. Don't impose your values on me. Don't judge me. Don't determine what I am. There are no universal ways in which you can judge. This particular argument, I always think of this in relation to an extremely offensive practice, clitoridectomies in the Middle East. The idea that a woman should have the organ of her sexual pleasure should be taken. And many feminists in the 1980s caught themselves in this horrible argument where they didn't want to impose universal Western values because that was deemed to be universalism dominating totalitarian, etc. But on the other hand, how did they deal with these practices which, on any account, should be deemed to be oppressive, offensive, etc. But the idea very simply was that we can't stand in judgment on other practices. Only those who participate in those practices can judge them. And thirdly, this links into what Jean-François Lyotard called the end of grand narratives. The grand narrative of emancipation which is the normative narrative, the moral narrative of the Enlightenment, and secondly, the grand narrative of scientific progress, the narrative of knowledge. And those two grand narratives, one that science will lead to a knowledge which is whole, which tells us what reality really is, and secondly, the idea that there is a moral universalism, embodied, for example, in Kant's notion of the categorical imperative. There is a moral universalism which it is possible for us to attain, even if only formally. Formally in terms of the possibility of making a universal judgment without dictating what the nature of that judgment would be as we get in Kant's rendition of the categorical imperative. However, if you have read Jacques Derrida's essay de France in preparation for today, you will realize that already in the 1960s, Derrida had announced the end of a politics of pure difference.